Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on Financial Edge Data Entry Tools and Tips. Today we have Chuck Hayes, the Director of Application Services here at Zobrio, to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go over all questions at the end. Thank you, and I will hand it over to Chuck.
Thank you, Colleen, and welcome, everyone. We thought about calling these the quarantine series, but since most of us work remotely anyway, it's not a whole lot different from our perspective. But anyway, I hope all of you are staying safe. So today we want to take a look at some different options within Financial Edge and FENXT for making data entry, just especially repetitive data entry, a little bit easier. So we're going to look at some of those tools and tips. Let's talk about the actual agenda, the topics we're covering, and then we'll dive right in. So we'll be looking at, on the general ledger side, the concept of journal entry defaults. There are actually kind of two levels of that we'll look at, and those are pretty specific to the user. So I'll distinguish between settings that might affect anybody using the system versus ones that only come into play when you're using the system. Vendor defaults, so in accounts payable, we have defaults, and these really help you when it comes to entering invoices. So if there are certain settings you always use for certain vendors, you can embed them in the vendor record, saves you some time with the invoice. Column reordering. So there are a number of grids throughout Financial Edge, and very often you have the option to do a little rearranging depending on what's important to you. The vendor record is a really good example of that. And those are specific to the user, it doesn't affect everybody. Recurring entries, so this is on the general ledger side, primarily, although there is the concept within accounts payable and accounts receivable with recurring invoices. But here we're focused more on the general ledger side, but I will point out the other two. And then a little bonus for those of you that have upgraded to FENXT, there's a feature in NXT that does not exist in the classic view, if you will, where you can copy an invoice, a very, very helpful feature. And I'll show you what the sequence is for that. So let's dive into journal entry defaults. So I'm in general ledger, journal entry, and I happen to have an open invoice with some information that I think will help even better illustrate the ins and outs of using defaults. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to start a new one. Change my mind at the last minute here. So I'm just starting a new batch. We'll do two just to illustrate a couple things. I'm just going to save the batch without closing it. So first of all, whenever you start a new batch, and this is true in FE or FENXT, there's this row with a D row, with the D moniker on the left. This is called the default row. What that means is that any entry that's in the default row will copy in rows. Different columns are available. Typically, though, your entries are varying the account number, so that may not make sense for a default. The post date might make sense, so you would just click inside the D row, if you will, and then you go ahead and put in whatever the date is that you're trying to do. So let's say I'm working back on the 15th, so I'll put in the 15th. Most organizations have encumbrances available, and in this case, I'm not doing an encumbered set of entries, so I'll just use regular. And typically the dollar amounts will change, but maybe the code I use for the reference will if you project from the typically the defaults that the moment that I the row, notice how defaults came down. Let's say that I do several rows, so pretend I just added several rows. And I'll just get an account number in here so I don't have a problem with the some sort of error message. So let's say that I did half of my journal entry batch with one date, but I want to use a different date, but still in the same period maybe, for the rest of the entries. So I can change my default and say, well, now the rest of these entries are going to be on the 20th. And notice that my existing row doesn't change, but then when I start a new row, I take on the characteristics of the default in the new row. So that's the basic concept of defaults while you're working within a batch. There is another level to this called default sets, and those can be used so that whenever you start a new batch, now again, this is for you, the user, not for everybody. When you start a batch, you want to load a particular set. Now, the sets are available to everybody, but you can specify, hey, this is my set. And you can either use these sets on an ad hoc basis, like when I go ahead and start a batch, maybe only certain batches need to use my set. And you may have noticed in the upper left, there's an area called default set. So I can do this on an ad hoc basis, or I have a user option that can say, look, I always want this to happen. So it can save you a little time. I will point out that one of the, what I'll call the shortfalls of that is that you can't dynamically set the date. But let me show you what the default set are, where they're laid, and how you use them. The binoculars from within this default box. This will take me to a location accessible from here. I can access the existing default sets. Let's take a look at this sample one that I created. I can just use the open button to open it up. And the various fields. Again, that this would load that D row. The purpose of this default set is to preload the D row so I don't have to go in and do the several entries I typically do. Now, what you won't be able to do is a dynamic date. So just keep in mind that you can't say, okay, put in today's date. That's not going to happen. But you could do like the encumbrance status and the journal entry and that type of thing. So again, depending on how you're going to use these default sets, you can go ahead and set them up, give them different names, and then bring them into play. So if I had started, for example, let me clear out this D row. Let's say that I wanted to use this feature and I had not filled in any of the D row. Let's just back up for a second here. Let me just save this. Oh, I didn't put an amount in the second row, so, or the first row. So let me just put in a dollar amount here. And I'm going to get rid of this row just so everything will save okay. Then I can illustrate all the clicks here. Okay, I think this will get me past my error messages. Oh, geez, I'm not paying attention, am I? One more time. This is why I was going to use the other one. We'll call this text. I think I'm okay. Let me just put a project in here. This database uses projects. There we go. At least I've got that saved. All right, so let's say that as soon as I start a new batch, but not every batch, but some batches, I want to use the default set. So I can just use the binoculars and then load my default set. And there's a button down in the lower left, or excuse me, checkbox, automatically load default field value, load field defaults. So click OK, and now those defaults automatically come into play. So create a default set, use it when you need it. And then I also mentioned that you may decide that you want all your batches, again, this is at the user level, you want all your batches to automatically load this default set. Well, that's a user option. User options are available from the tools menu, and I can do that from within the batch or from the shell. So tools menu options. Of course, I'm in general ledger, and since I did it from within a batch, the setting went right to the location here. So you'll see that I'm in journal entry on the records tab, if you go the long way from some other location. And then on the grid on the right, the very last option says, load this default set on all batches. So I click where you see the word none, use the binoculars, and then I could go ahead and select that sample set that I showed you a moment ago, set it to automatically load. And then from then on, whenever I start a brand new batch, it'll load. So let's see how that looks. So I'll start a new regular batch. Notice that my default set is automatically listed in the upper left, and the default's automatically loaded because of the checkbox. And again, that's related to my user options. Now we'll come back to journal entry for our recurring entries, but that's pretty much how journal entry defaults work. Let's move on to the topic of vendor defaults. So in accounts payable, there are a number of settings in the vendor record that can be used to automatically fill in some fields within the invoice record. So let's take a look at what the choices are. So I'm going to use this particular vendor, good old David Case. And what I thought I would do is start connecting the dots in terms of settings and then what happens in a new invoice. So I'm going to come back to this tab. So I'm going to use the activity tab and just start a new invoice. And we should be able to look at both of these at the same time. All right. So first of all, obviously, the vendor's the same. But let's take a look at settings that showed up in the invoice record that are related to the vendor record. So on the left-hand side of the vendor record, you'll see that a couple things are filled in as defaults, the terms. Well, what are those? Because I don't see those yet on the other side. Well, that's dependent on entering a date in the invoice. The payment method in the lower left, electronic funds transfer, that automatically filled in the new invoice. Notice there's a payment options on the vendor record on the left, one payment for all invoices. Well, that's related to this checkbox in the lower right, create a separate payment for this invoice. So the way FE works is that if an invoice is set with the checkbox to create a separate payment for this invoice, then even if I have 5 invoices for that vendor, this particular one, if I use this checkbox, will be on its own check or EFT notice. If I don't use the checkbox, then the assumption in the system is, well, I'm just going to consolidate them into a single check. So if I were to say, no, this particular vendor, every invoice must be on a separate payment, then you can preset that to one payment per invoice, which effectively checks this box. Now, as far as the account to use on the left, this is referring to the bank account record that's set up in Financial Edge to work with accounts payable. In this database, there's really only one that will work with AP. So you notice it says operating. Well, that shows up on the payments and credits tab of the invoice. Up at the top, you'll see it set for the operating bank account. If you only have one bank, it'll pretty much work, but it's not a bad idea to set this up inside here. And then you'll notice in the lower left, I picked David because I knew he was set up as a 1099 vendor. Well, there are some settings that impact the invoice and some that don't. If I just check the box 1099 vendor, that has no impact on a new invoice. Doesn't make any difference for that new invoice. What does make a difference though, is this button for the 1099 distribution. So this is called the default distribution. So what do you want to have normally happen in a new invoice? So let's take a look. So this is set up to assume 100% of the invoice will be non-employee compensation. So if I look at my newly created invoice on the right, notice the 1099 distribution on the right-hand side is checked, and I have the same option. Now what's not filled in yet is the dollar amount. The setting is waiting to do 100%, but I haven't added a dollar amount to the invoice. So if I add a dollar amount to the invoice, it should fill in. Let's take a look. There we go. Now all 100% filled in. Side point, as you probably already know, I'm not required to keep this setting. I can delete it with the delete key and just delete the whole row. And you can also put a lower amount as the actual 1099 amount. Perhaps $50 was for reimbursement of expenses. Let's go back to this idea of terms. So this goes to, in combination with, 2 other things. So the term setting is based on configuration settings for, okay, if it's net 10, and I'll use the magnifying glass to look, it means that payment is due in 10 days. Yeah, it's 10 days, although it looks like this one is not set correctly. Just notice that, so we'll make this set for 10 days. So I fixed that setting. Anyway, so this says net 10. There's also a net 30 in here and a couple others for early payment discounts. Now this will play off of 2 things. One, the invoice date, but also a user option. So let me go to the user option first. So in Tools Options, again, invoice, actually it's under Invoice Activity. You'll see that the second choice is called Default Invoice Due Date. Now, some of you may not bother with managing due dates, and you may just have this set to be blank in your user options because you just type in, or maybe you set it for today or something like that, because those are some of the choices. And if that's the case, fine. But if you do use terms, then those are tied back to the vendor default. So this has said, no, use the terms, which means terms in the vendor record. And in this case, the terms are net 10. So if I add, I did adjust the settings. So if I add, so let's put in the 15th. Again, I can just use the day. Notice how the due date defaulted to 10 days later because that's the 25th, and that was based on the terms. So vendor default for terms also require that your user options say, okay, use the vendor terms, and then the due date will be calculated from the invoice date. Another option related to the vendor record has to do with the address that's used on the invoice, which technically is the address for payments. So you'll see in the middle of the right-hand side with the invoice, it says remit to payment address. Well, how does the system know what that is? Well, I'm going to look at this primary address on the vendor record to show you the location of the setting. So I'll just click the address button. It's located on the options tab of the particular address at issue. And notice this says default address for new invoices. And on the general tab, it's called the payment address. So the reason why the payment address was chosen, even though he doesn't have other addresses, the reason why it was chosen is specifically because of that checkbox, or if he doesn't have any other choices. And then lastly, we have the general ledger distribution. So if you take a look at David's invoice, it automatically filled in. Now, not everybody uses this option because a lot of times there are variations by department or office or something, and it's just not worth the trouble of correcting a default general ledger distribution. But if you decide you want to use it, at least for a few vendors. So inside the vendor record, there's a distribution tab. So you just specify what is the distribution that I would normally expect to use that will automatically copy into new invoices. And I usually position it as, okay, what saves you keystrokes? So if you're changing every GL distribution every time, it's probably easier just to type that into the new invoice. But if maybe only half the time you're changing the numbers, then okay, then why not put in some defaults and save yourself a little trouble here. Okay, so those are the basics of the vendor defaults. Again, they affect new invoices. Back to our list of topics, column reordering. So there are a number of places inside Financial Edge where you will see what is essentially a grid. And in some cases, the grid will allow you to rearrange the grid. And those rearrangings, they're kind of like user options, although you don't do it from the tools menu. They're actually stored, I'll get real geeky for a minute, they're stored in the Windows registry. So it is specific to your login. So it's just for you. So I'll go back to the vendor record for a moment. So one of the common situations that I run into where this is most often requested is on the activity tab of the vendor record. So first of all, I will add an additional point that we've talked about in other Zobrio University sessions, but there are potentially some hidden columns. So I'm going to activate a couple of hidden columns and then show you the two different methods that you can rearrange. So first of all, if you want to access the column choices, just do a right click on the grid, just open up one vendor record, and when you're finished, you save it, and that'll make sure the changes stay in place for the future. But let's go to columns, and you'll see the default list on the right, and there are two columns, especially the last check number is a big one, so I'm going to move that over. So what was the payment number that was used? Now, the reason why it says last check is because you have the option to use more than one payment for an invoice. You can do partial payments, and so therefore it's the most recent one. So I'll go ahead and click OK. Now that will put my setting into play Sometimes when you do this, you might get an error message when it first renders. Just close the vendor, reopen, everything will be fine. It's trying to locate the numbers to populate. Okay, so I have activated this column just to show you that, but maybe when I'm looking at the vendor record, I prefer to have this last check number show up to the left-hand side. So just grab the column header. There are two methods for doing this. Just grab, left click and hold the column header, and now I can move it over. See the red vertical line. So now going forward, if I open any vendor, so I move the last check number to be the first column. This setting is just for Chuck when he logs in, but it impacts every vendor as long as I save and close the record. So I'm going to save and close. Now I'm just going to pick a different vendor, go to the activity tab, and there's the last check number in the first column. So going back to David, I said there were two ways to rearrange the columns. So one is just by moving them from the activity tab in this case. The other choice is back to the right-click columns action. You'll see that on the right-hand side, there's an option to use the arrows when you select a column. So if I want to move the last check number down, and maybe I want to put it, after the type or something, I can use the arrows here, and that effectively also rearranges the position. But if I don't like that, I can move it however I wish. There are some other grids where this is true. You'll see that in the journal entry grid. Some of the records in like accounts receivable and things have activity tabs where you can do a little rearranging. So just remember, if you see a grid, do a right click, check columns. And if there's an option to rearrange, then you'll see those arrows, and that'll answer the question, can I rearrange this grid? Again, not all grids can be arranged, and also it's specific to the user, doesn't affect everybody, but it does affect all records of that type. Recurring entries. So there are several types of recurring entries. Let me briefly mention the ones that would require a different session, but inside, say, accounts payable vendors, there's the option for recurring invoices. That's a whole different complex topic where you set up a recurring invoice. It kind of looks like an invoice, but then you also set up a schedule associated with it. And so then you can say unlimited or fixed or that kind of thing. So if you have a 12-month lease or a lease that renews annually, you could set up for 12 periods. And then you have to do a process from accounts payable processing called generate the invoices. So both accounts payable and accounts receivable have that option for recurring invoices. General ledger is more often used in my experience. And in that case, there's the option for recurring journal entry batches. And again, this is an often requested feature. So in this system, a recurring batch is a batch that I refer to as a template. That's not the system's name for it, but that's what I like to call it, because it's a series of entries that will be used in a new batch. You can see the recurring batches by switching the batch type on the journal entry page. So you notice there's a recurring amount batch, and percentages work pretty much the same way. So in this example, we have like a utilities example for direct allocation. We have a grant activity that we use when we sample reimbursement, sample contributions, but they all pretty much look the same. So you set up, the account numbers, statuses, journal reference, that type of stuff. Now, what's different here is that this one is set up with dollar amounts because maybe you're on some sort of fixed payment plan. But if that's not the case, then you're probably better off just switching these to zeros, which is something that makes life a lot easier. So I can go ahead and say, look, I'm always going to have electricity, water, security, and all this, and I aggregate those bills, but the dollars change. So I just want the basics, and then I'll fill in the dollars each time. Some folks will do this for payroll batches. So I set up this recurring batch. And I'll show you, you can always start one, there's a new button on the page, but there is a way to take an existing batch and make it a recurring batch, which I'll show you in a little bit. So once I've got this available, then there is what I'll call a highly recommended sequence to use a recurring batch that will make your life much easier. Because if you just copy a batch or you use it from within the batch, certain things don't happen. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I switch back to regular batch, and I want to use a recurring batch, the first thing you do is just start a new regular batch. So I'll do a new regular batch. I'll call this test 4, and I'll save it. Okay, so you start a new regular batch. The next step is to invoke or copy in the recurring batch, but you'll have a very special setting that I really like. So if I go into the batch menu, you'll see an option called Use a Recurring Batch. I will see a list of the recurring batches that I just showed you in the different view. And I'll go ahead and use this utility example since that's the one I happen to open. I'll go ahead and open the recurring batch, but now I get the magic box that everybody wants. So what is going to be the date of that recurring batch? So if you've ever copied a batch, you'll notice that the batch copies like the date, and you get either today's date or the original. It gets messy. With this, I can specify the date. So again, I'm going to use my 15th date, which is not today. Click OK, everything comes in with that particular date. So set up the recurring batch, start a new batch, use the batch menu to select the recurring batch, and you'll get a prompt for the particular date. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that you can take an existing batch and turn it into a recurring batch. So for example, I don't think I want to use a subledger batch for that. So let's see here. We don't have a lot that aren't subledger. I'll just use my little test thing here. So let's look at my test. So this is my test that I was using to create some activity for a special report I wanted to run. So I've got this activity, and let's say that this is coming from an outside service for payroll. So it's not coming from our internal payroll system in FE. We have an external company that does that. They send us, the information, and then maybe the dollars don't change a lot for this group of people. So I just have a minor amount of editing to do. So we'll call this just my test 2. I say, you know what? Every time I copy this, I have to change, the dates get messy. So what I want to do is save this as a recurring batch, and then I can bypass that date problem. So I'm going to go ahead and use this menu at the top. You'll see an icon that says copy batches regular. Well, that's not what I want, because that's where I have to get messy with the dates. So instead, I'm going to use the drop-down arrow and copy batches recurring amount. So now everything that was in my batch gets copied. But now this is a recurring batch. See in the title bar, new recurring amount batch. I'm going to get rid of the fact that it was copied from another one. And so this will be a period JE. You can give this a batch ID. Maybe I'll call it payroll 1. And of course, I got my default set in here. At any rate, so I go ahead, notice there's no date column because recurring batches do not store a date because you enter that when you're copying them. So I'll go ahead and save and close. Now let's take a look at that, where that lives now. So let me go back to my view of recurring batches. And there's the payroll recurring batch that I created by copying an existing batch. And then, like I said before, I can go ahead and start a new journal entry batch. And I need to get back to my regular batches. I don't have anything in here, so I'll just use this one. So batch, use a recurring batch. Now I can use my pay period JE and set this for last week. And now I'll just do some minor editing of that payroll information. And that's how you can use recurring entries in general ledger. And then lastly, we have a little bonus feature for those of you who have upgraded to FENXT, copy invoices. So if I go back to accounts payable in what is now called database view, if I create an invoice, there's no option to copy an existing invoice. It just doesn't exist in this view, but it has been added to the NXT view. So I believe I'm correctly logged into NXT in our Zobrio sample database here. So the sequence is you start a new invoice, and then you have the option to copy a previous one. So you have to work within, obviously it's vendor specific, and you can start new invoices from the invoices page, or I'm within a vendor record where I knew there were some other invoices. So I'm just going to use the add an invoice button within the vendor record. Again, it doesn't matter where you start, but you have to start a new invoice. So I start a new invoice, and if I'm doing it from another location, I have to select the vendor. But once I do that, then I'll be presented with an option to copy previous. So on the right-hand side, you'll see copy previous invoice. The system will show the last 3 invoices that you created, but you can search for any invoice from that vendor, especially if you know the invoice ID. So I can just pick this one, this particular one, and just do a double click, copy this in the first invoice that's listed, and then all the fields should magically come over. So again, that feature is not available within the database view, but it is available within the NXT view. And that brings us to the end of our session for today. So we talked about journal entry defaults to save repetitive entry like the date and things like that in the rows. Vendor defaults to help you with new invoices, rearranging some of the grids such as the vendor activity tab. Recurring entries in the general ledger side, and I pointed out there are recurring invoices in both AP and in AR. And then lastly, the option to copy invoices in NXT view. So we really appreciate your joining our session today. If you have any questions, you're welcome to contact our sales manager, Matt Kreutzer, and he can help you with any features that are of interest to you or some training hours or that type of thing. And again, I hope everyone is staying safe. So I'm going to hang around just for a minute to see if we have any questions in the chat window, but thank you so much for attending today.